We are continuing our podcast series of pro-child politics authors, this week with Maria Baer, reporter and co-host of Breakpoint This Week with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Maria Baer is a writer, reporter, and podcast host. She's been published at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, World, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, and elsewhere. In 2023, Maria won an Evangelical Press Association award for her coverage of prison conditions for pregnant women in Christianity Today. Maria's work can also be found at her website, www.mariaebaer.com, and in her Substack newsletter, It Is As If. Maria lives in Ohio with her husband and 2 daughters, and we're having a conversation about digital technology, which is the chapter she wrote for Pro-Child Politics. We hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Them Before Us podcast. I'm your host, Jen Friesen, and we would love to welcome Maria to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
That was a bug, sorry. I forgot. I'm like, oh yeah, we're visual, I have to be careful. And yeah, if people can hear, there's kids upstairs and this is a hardwood floor. So we'll see what the tech, speaking of tech, we will see what the tech is like when it comes to podcasting and stuff. Maria, people, so we got to hear your bio a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I'd love to know a little more of your background, but particularly how you got interested in this topic for the chapter in pro-child politics.
Yeah. I mean, I think like most people going through the COVID years, I was fortunate enough. My oldest daughter was only in preschool, so it wasn't, I feel like both of my girls kind of avoided the worst of it. But my husband does a lot of work within the school choice space, and we're very involved with a local Christian school here in my city. So we were kind of watching this play out and really couldn't believe, like most people, we're just shocked by what we were seeing. Not only the ways that the kids were, I guess being treated, or being sort of left by the wayside during all of this, but also just the things that were coming out, the way people were approaching technology within schooling during that time was really strange. And I guess I hadn't been privy to this before then because, like I said, my kids hadn't been in school, so I wasn't seeing it, but I hadn't realized just how much digital tech had really infiltrated the classroom. And I think that was one of the first times we all kind of got to see it. Now, of course, it increased during COVID for obvious reasons, but it had already kind of happened by that point. I mean, the digital revolution was in school for sure. And so I, through my work at the Colson Center, we talk a lot about being intentional about our lives. I know that sounds trite, but thinking about what is the goal? What does it mean to be human? What is the goal of life? Why are we here? What kind of people are we? What are kids, and how are kids different from adults, and what do they need? And all of those kinds of things. And I felt like, especially like I said, during those COVID years, we were not culturally asking those questions where and when we should. We were just kind of blindly assuming that because we'd had the wherewithal or the luck, to invent the technology that we have now, then of course we're going to use it. And we weren't necessarily taking a step back to ask, should we use it?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I'm one of the last, so I'm like middle 30s, older millennial, and we're some of the last generation to have grown up without a smartphone. Like we have a very definitive time where I remember our first cell phone was shared between my 2 siblings and myself. We were homeschooled, and then we'd go to like homeschool PE on the bus at the YMCA. We had a shared cell phone because we were together. Yeah, and it was the kind of doing the T9 texting. And when my sister and I each got our own flip phone, I was like 18 years old. So we didn't grow up. Go ahead.
Right. I got my parents gave me a flip phone. I think I was 16, and I absolutely hated it because the only other people with a cellular phone was my parents. So they were the only people that called me. So I felt like I'd been low-jacked. So yeah, that probably dates me as well. But
yeah, you're like trying to leave it behind. Well, and we were, my mom was very tech savvy. She was one of the first people I knew, adults I knew, to have a cell phone when we were kids. And we were the first people with an email address, like a Juno email address, right? But we're talking now about kids they've grown up with all the kinds of tech readily available, whether it's tablets, cell phones, little kids knowing how to work the smart TV, etc. But one of the lies you identify in your chapter in Pro-Child Politics is that some people think the only harms that a kid can suffer from tech is obscene images or bullying and some of those things, which are bad. But you kind of go into, there's some other things that are potentially harmful to kids with tech. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, I did become concerned the more I was researching about this. It feels like anytime anybody kind of gets close to addressing this issue of digital tech and how we're giving it to kids and when, the main problem brought up is the content, right? So we're worried about bullying on social media or even social media addiction or obviously pornography or exploitation. And all of those things we should certainly be concerned with and be watching out for. But if that's the sole focus of where we put our energy in terms of like regulation and thinking more intentionally about these things, then we're going to miss the boat because I quoted Jonathan Haidt, who of course just wrote sort of the manifesto on this. His newest book is called The Anxious Generation, which I highly recommend. And he basically posits in that book that this kind of digital technology in the hands of kids has fundamentally rewritten childhood. And I think what he means is that it has changed the way children think about themselves, they think about the world, and they think about their relationships with others. And, there's a researcher from MIT named Sherry Turkle, who is sort of a cultural commentator, philosopher about technology. She's been writing about this since the 70s. And she is a fascinating thinker. And she was studying, I think, as early as, I want to say it's the early 80s. She did a study while she was at MIT about even like the most rudimentary electronic games and how they were changing the way kids thought. And one of the things she found was, and again, this is the technology of the early 80s, so light years away from the digital tech we have today. When she noticed that after a few days of playing these games with each other, kids started to, for example, anthropomorphize the games. So they'd say, you can cheat, it doesn't know. Like he doesn't know you're cheating, or the game wouldn't let me win, or certain things where, and she just thought, okay, that's interesting. And I think we have seen that happen on a much larger scale, where it's not like you and I, where we grew up and learned how to be a person and be in the world with other people in the analog way. And now we see how it can be sometimes useful to use digital technology to as a shortcut, right? For communication or whatever it might be. When kids don't get that experience of learning the analog way first, whether that's actual learning in school or even social learning, it will fundamentally change what they think they are, what they think digital tech is, and what it can and can't do for them, and what other people are. All those fundamental questions I said at the beginning. What does it mean to be human? Why are we here? What is the goal of life? What does flourishing look like? Those all get skewed when we start with digital tech that early.
Yeah. Even in a more very like practical sense, there's a meme that goes around that says another day passed and I didn't have to use algebra today. Or it's kind of the joke of like, why did I have to learn this? But I was pointing this out to some kids I was chatting. They were talking about their math class. They go to a classical Christian school. So really, no phones allowed in the classrooms. Pretty rigorous.
Yeah.
And a big community of parents that don't let their kids have phones or social media. So that's all very positive in that way. But I was thinking about how, well, actually, I drove my car, I used a computer, I did all these things. I did use algebra. I used the highest levels of math. I just had no idea.
Sure.
I don't know what they are or how to use them, right? But learning the correct way to use things and understanding how things function in the world versus just I turn on my computer, it works. We are helpless in a lot of ways now that we weren't before.
Yeah. And think about all of the intangible things that you learn through something like algebra too. So I hated all math. I deliberately became a journalist so that I wouldn't have to take any math classes in college. But when going through learning something that's difficult for you, think about what that teaches you about your ability to problem solve, your ability to ask for help, to persevere when something's difficult. I don't mean to be trite about it, but that is not unimportant. That is a big part of it. And then I also think that, we'd be surprised when you learn something in elementary school or something a little bit more rudimentary. It becomes kind of sometimes second nature. You might not even realize how much math you are actually doing every day. But actually what you said, that meme about, I've seen that too. Like, I guess, they lied to me. I don't need to know the Pythagorean theorem or whatever it is. It made me think of this quote from somebody at Google. This was the director of Google's education apps group. So his name is Jonathan Rochelle. He was giving a speech in 2016. And he said this, quote, "I can't answer for them." He's talking about his own children. "I can't answer for them what they're going to do with the quadratic equation. I don't know why they are learning it. And I don't know why they can't just ask Google for the answer if the answer is right there." So that's that's the meme, but he was saying it not as a meme. He meant it. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things that is really important to recover in this conversation is that kids need to learn that it's good to know things for their own sake.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a belief that I have about the world, but I also believe it's true, not just for me, but for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that God made the world in a certain way and with order, in part because he wanted us to know him, and it is, his handiwork. So understanding the world is valuable on its own terms, whether or not we can assign some sort of utilitarian, pragmatic success from it or whatever. I can point to, I made $10 because I knew this, or I, achieved this success. Knowing things on its own is its own success. And if the people designing the digital tech that is, revolutionizing the education space right now do not believe it's good to know things, or can't explain why it's good to know things for knowledge is for the sake of knowledge itself, then I think we should be reticent to trust them with as much as we're trusting them with right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, and there's two thoughts I have out of that too. First of all, if the only way to know something is to Google it, now we're going to be in big trouble. I mean, we've seen with tech how much they can manipulate what there is to be known. Even people who read 1984 are saying when they go back and are editing the news from the past and saying things that, like the border czar thing, she never said she was the border czar. And what if they'd just been able to clip and destroy all the evidence of that? We have to be able to know things beyond just, can I search it online? But I also thought, even when we don't always have the ability to just search everything, sometimes that's better. Like wondering, that's the joke when I've gone camping. I'm the person who loves, if I have a question, I love to look up the answer right away. So people think like, oh, you're smart or you know things, but it's only because of curiosity and I like to look it up or look up an actor, a movie or something. And then you go camping and you have a cell phone and you do what they did in the olden days where you had to wonder something and just wonder it. You didn't know
Wait
and
and
you can't
wonder.
go look it up.
There's something kind of magic about that. I mean, it could be annoying too. I think that's kind of morally neutral, but I have experienced what you're saying too. I learned Spanish in school, so I also studied that in college. And I mean, hypothetically, with all the incredible translation apps and software available right now, nobody ever needs to learn another language. And if I, even with the Spanish that I've learned, if I come across a word I don't know, or I'm trying to say something, I can't figure it out, I can Google very quickly what the word is.
Yeah.
But there's something that happens when you internalize a language that you're learning, where, there is always a point in the conversations I have with people in Spanish where my thoughts turn over into Spanish. It's usually at like the 5-minute mark, right? That cannot happen if you're just Googling everything. The end result is the same in a utilitarian sense. You could probably have the same conversation, but the journey there was profoundly different. And I think some of these things could be morally neutral, but I would say learning things with an appreciation for the world as it is extremely important. That's not morally neutral.
That's really good. I have a friend who's from another country, so English is her second language. And we were chatting about how she's like, unless someone can speak her native tongue, they can't fully know her, in the sense of she's like, my humor and a lot of these things I'm not able to translate to be fully myself in another language. And now picture if we were using technology to try and translate that from human to technology to human, you are going to miss something that can't be replicated human to human.
Totally.
In the chapter, you talk about the COVID lockdowns, and you mentioned that a little bit earlier. And there has been kind of a move. I don't know. We wrote an article about it at Them Before Us that I don't remember who it was, kind of a bigger politician that just was saying, we need to get Wi-Fi and computers into every school. The digital divide is the problem, basically why some kids underperform and some kids are great. And our point was, well, having a mom and dad in the home is a much bigger deal for kids, but they don't want to talk about that. They're like, let's give everyone a free computer. And they get Google and Microsoft to donate and those sorts of things. But You talk about the lie is that digital technology can educate. Can you talk more
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. So this is a big part of, again, I saw some of those quotes as well. I included one of them in the chapter about this, the digital divide is the big problem. And what the presumption that was going unchallenged in that is that this is learning, right? That, we can solve this learning crisis during COVID by just getting a computer into every kid's hands without asking the question, do kids actually learn on computers? And if they do, is it as good as they learn physically or in person? And the answer is unequivocally no. And we knew
Right.
that before COVID. I mean, we've known this for decades now. There's tons of social science data and research on this where, for example, if you read something on a physical page as opposed to reading it on a digital screen, you will remember it for longer and you will retain more of the information.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true if you write something as opposed to typing it. And I think this points to a bigger truth, which is that, again, part of what it means to be human is to be bodies and minds and souls. We are not just minds. And too often, digital technology in the education space treats kids as if they're just minds. And all we need to do is basically teach you this choreography of which keys to press in which order, and you'll get the right answer. And you don't need to know why that's the right answer. Just trust us, it's the right answer. And you've taken so much away from that childhood at that point. Not only their ability to remember those things for longer, but again, their ability to understand the value of knowledge itself. Learning just involves our bodies, whether we like it or not. The best learning happens when our bodies are involved too. Just the same way that the best relationships are built in person. The strongest families are families that are in physical proximity to each other. I think some of the best experiences in life involve all of these parts about being human. We know the benefits of being outside, for example, or physical exercise, but we know this in all these other areas. For some reason, we've just been happy to completely take that out of the classroom in a lot of these areas. And that's not a good idea. It's not going to end well. And we're already seeing, kids just don't learn as well when they do it digitally.
Yeah. When you see too, a lot of the games, my brother was talking to me about this the other day. A lot of these games are marketed toward men where you're building and creating. And he said these worlds are so beautifully done and immersive, and you can do all these, collect all these things and build this. But we've moved away as a society. There aren't as many opportunities maybe for men to do those things for real as there was when it was like hop in a covered wagon and go explore the West. Go West, young
Right.
man, kind of thing. Or, just
Yeah.
men and women are single and there isn't as much of this drive to like, yeah, you're going to get a house and get a piece of land and like be able to do that for real. So we're sort of trying to replicate it in fake ways. And it's almost the same with, instead of kids spending a lot of time being outdoors and working hard on something, I'm not exactly sure how to do it. They're doing some of the problem solving and some of the games and community, but it's in like a pathway way. Maybe there's some benefit to it, but it's
A
not as good. It's
simulation.
kind of a shadow. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. So with the video, there are some really incredible video games out there, and there's so much artistry and skill that goes into building those and even in playing them. But one of the crucial things about that is knowing when it's appropriate to introduce those into a person's life and for what purpose. So giving a 20-year-old a game like that could be wonderful and open a whole world of possibility and creativity. Giving a first grader something like that and saying, here, this will replace your classroom, which is what schools were saying during COVID. And what some of them are still implicitly saying now is something totally different, which is why it's so important that when we're thinking about this, about when to introduce tech and how to use it, we're taking into account what are kids, what stage of development are they in, and what do they need at that stage. We need to prioritize those things over the convenience or the ease or even, the cool factor of some of these games. But what you said is extremely true and has been borne out in the research. There is research, for example, I don't think I had space to include this in the book, but this was research done in the 90s that kids, after prolonged exposure to just digital content, so in the 90s, it was TV basically, but just digital content, videos, screens, after time a person's ability to notice differing shades of color and to differentiate different sounds diminishes.
Wow.
So the world literally becomes less vivid the more screen time you have. And again, some of this is morally neutral. I mean, we adults should decide how they want to spend their time, and their brains can be molded. The problem is too many people don't understand that about digital tech, because the companies making the tech obviously are not going to be upfront about it. But it's a different thing when we're talking about what do kids deserve. And there is just no replacing or meaningfully replicating the physical world.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and if you have the sleep timer on your phone, some of those things can turn it to grayscale, or they turn the blue light off.
The blue light off. That's true.
Maybe they're
they
being
make those
obligated by
glasses,
law
I think, too,
to add those things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. You've probably heard this, but when I first heard this, it blew my mind, and I just re-looked it up. And I saw, so it was CNBC and Business Insider had articles about how all the big tech gurus, Jobs, Gates, Mark Cuban, all the limits they have for their kids with tech. They're not allowed to have tech at the table. They didn't get tech until they were in their teens or older teens. Mark Cuban was saying he monitors all his kids' phone use, and they have to put them away at 10 p.m. And so you realize the people who are the most inside and understand it the most don't let their kids use it. That's very telling, I think.
Red flag for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. One of the other, you've touched on this a little bit, but a truth that you identify in the chapter is that technology can't replace human embodiment. And so you touched on that a little bit, because you're saying humans are not just minds. And that's kind of what tech is sort of, as long as your kid is entertained by the screen right here, that's sort of okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to have an embodied childhood?
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan Haidt writes about this as well, right? Like the amount of learning that takes place when you're doing something physically, as opposed to even just reading or hearing theory about it. So everybody, I think, intuitively knows this to one degree or another. My daughters are learning to play the violin, and I decided to start learning along with them, which is a common practice in the Suzuki method. But I'm also secretly really loving it, even though I sound just terrible. The violin is so difficult to learn. But one of the things that becomes immediately clear when you pick up a violin, and most other instruments as well, is that you can read about how to play the violin all day long, and you can read about where to place your fingers and how to hold your arm and hold the bow and all, the theory and all of that. It is a different thing entirely to translate that into motion, into physical motion, which is what's required to make sound on a violin. It is a physical act, right? And to some degree in violin practice, more so even than other instruments, learning it just involves repetition. It's just doing it over and over again. Specifically with, one of the things that always fascinated me about the violin is, how do they know where to put their fingers exactly? Because if you move it 1/8 of an inch to the left or right, it's a different note. And the answer is because they've played these notes in this order a million times. And something, it was ingrained into their body how to play this instrument. I think that same theory plays out in all forms of education. So whether it's learning something like algebra, in front of you, or it's learning about how to be in the world and what is my body like and what can it do? And how do other people respond to me? And what does the ocean feel like? All these different things that are teaching us about the world that God made and the world that we're in and our place in it and what it means to be human. It just is going to involve our bodies just as much as it involves our minds. And when we, try again to replace it or to replicate it, it's just going to be a cheaper simulation at that point.
Yeah. All right, let's wrap up with, you end your chapter with a bunch of practical things. There's kind of the bigger policy practical things we talked about a little bit, like not having schools or phones in the classroom. Even public schools are moving this direction, and parents can have a lot to do with that, influencing schools in that way. And, kids under 2 years old not having the tech or screens at all could be. What are some other practical things just for people listening? They don't have any political or policy power necessarily, other than maybe voting. but maybe they have kids and they're trying to think through what are practical things I can be doing
Yeah.
to help have an embodied childhood or
Yeah.
help with my kids. What are the things you saw when you were writing your chapter?
Sure. So I would say pretty unequivocally, I'm not ready to make blanket statements about too many things that are in this vein, but this one I feel really confident about. Kids really should not be given screens before the age of 2. There's just too much research about what it does to brain development and specifically the gray matter in the brain that can't be undone once it is done. Now, that doesn't mean that every kid who was given a screen before age 2 is just doomed to failure and that, their life is less vivid. But I think that it is pretty clear at this point that that is a really critical step, which that's hard. As a mom of 2 young girls, I mean, they're in elementary school now, but it is so tempting when your kids, want it and when they can be very easily pacified and occupied for 15 minutes while you make dinner or whatever it is. But I think we can do it. We've done it in the past. And I think we can do it too if we help each other, so that's a major one. Another one I think is, even outside of running for school board or pushing for legislation, every parent has the right to be a voice in the way that their child is educated, whether you're in a private school or charter school or a public school. You have the right to speak into how that's done. And, something as simple as when schools start doing all of their communications digitally, say, just register maybe your opinion that you don't love that, or ask if there's an analog version, because one of the hardest things, especially when kids are older and they're getting into social media, if parents are trying to implement limits or to, give a realistic view of digital tech to their kids, but their coaches are communicating with them exclusively over this, or their teachers or the school or the school district or whatever it is, that gets harder and harder for parents. So listen, throw the parents a bone, do some physical, send home a physical newsletter like they used to do things analog, or at least offer that option. And if you're a parent, ask for it. What harm could that do? I think also another really important kind of concrete thing we can do is, and I spoke with somebody who runs a ministry called Protect Young Eyes. This is a ministry specifically that protects kids from sexual exploitation on the internet and pornography. And this organization does a lot of lobbying for age verification laws in different states. So if you're trying to log onto a pornographic site, that you would have to submit your driver's license or whatever it is for age verification, which is a great step. But something else he said that I was unaware of before I talked to him was that when you get a piece of smart technology, so a smartphone or an iPad or whatever it is, 9 out of 10 times it is coming out of the box in its most permissive setting possible. The onus is on the owner if they want to put in more parental controls or make it more locked down. And when I was interviewing him, he told me it takes something like, in the iPhone 11, if you want to put it in the most locked down version possible, like the most parental controls available to you, it takes like 30 different moves. It is a complicated process, and you've got to figure out how to do it, how to undo it. It should really be the other way around. And this is them before us's sweet spot, right? Is how do we put the needs and desires of kids first? Here's a very, very concrete, simple way. Our digital tech should come out of the box in its most locked down version. And the onus should be on the grown-ups to figure out how to get it to the version that they want to use it as. We do this with so many other things. And this is, again, I have to credit Chris at Protect Young Eyes with this, but think about public swimming pools. If we just know that a pool is going to be somewhere where kids might even happen to cross the street near it, it has to have a fence and a gate, and it has to be locked in 2 places, and all of these, and rightfully so, because kids don't understand the risk as well as parents, and it's more dangerous for them. So we do that. We take on that burden. We make it harder for grown-ups to get into the pool because of kids. We should be doing that with digital tech as well.
That's great. Yeah, it never even really occurred to me. I'm pretty tech savvy, so I can figure those things out, of course. But yeah, when you think about wanting to give your kids different things, why couldn't they come in that way? That's a great, I've never even thought. That's great. Awesome. Well, Maria, thanks for the conversation. Thanks so much for your contribution to the book. And where can people find you?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jen. This was a
Yeah.
thrill. I'm just proud to be a part of this. So I have a Substack at Maria Baer, which is spelled Baer, .substack.com. I also just have a sort of a landing page where I update all of the recent pieces I've done kind of around the internet. And that's just mariaebaer.com. So all one word, mariaebaer.com, and you'll find links to, all of my work. And you can also please do listen to the Breakpoint This Week podcast with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. That is just an honor to be co-hosting that, and a lot of fun. So I'm always over there every Friday.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, everyone, you will find those links in our show notes as well. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for joining the movement.